There is a massive issue plaguing the Western world. It is arguably our most serious problem, and if allowed to continue at its current rate, it will destroy our entire civilization. It'll be obvious to many of you that I'm talking about immigration. What I want to do in this video is explain the sheer scale of this enormous problem, using a few European nations as examples. We don't want to dwell excessively on the problem itself and become black-pilled. We need to study it enough to find a solution that we can direct our efforts into. I'm going to use a few different nations that have noticeably different immigration scenarios. We're seeing different numbers of people coming in, whether a few or many, and we're seeing different types of people coming in, which affects our cultures in separate ways. A large number of South Asian Muslims will create a very different circumstance than a large number of South American Catholics. Let's start with a nation whose crisis isn't necessarily simple. Arguably, no immigration crisis is simple, but isn't all too complicated either. The United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Britain's immigration crisis can be dated back to the early post-war era. Immigration slowly started rising after World War II, but wasn't all too high or disastrous until more recently. Net migration was very low throughout the 1970s, the 1980s, and started rising noticeably in the 1990s. Though it wasn't very high, some rightfully predicted the problems it would cause if allowed to go on unchecked. These predictions were generally right. There was a sharp rise in the late 1990s under the Labour Prime Minister Tony Blair, who can be seen as the man most at fault for Britain's modern problems. His creation of the managerial, bureaucratic state has been disastrous, and one of the things he pushed for was mass migration, despite no desire ever coming from the British people. Net migration got even higher in the 2000s, and stayed relatively stable at this rate until very recently, when the Conservatives and Prime Minister Boris Johnson opened the floodgates after 2020. The justification was that workers were needed, and net migration skyrocketed from a bit over 200,000 per year to a peak of almost 800,000. This is a catastrophe for Britain, to put it frankly. Millions of non-British people, most hostile to the nation and its people, now reside within its borders, and even if they don't conduct crime, they are drastically affecting the culture of the country. It is a big deal to feel like a stranger in your own nation. Everyone knows this is the case, and that it's a bad thing specifically, but it's the right that recognizes immigration as being the primary fuel behind it. A common image in large British cities is a street full of people, but only a minority being white. Large masses of women in hijabs or men in ski masks wander the streets, conducting whatever business they're involved in. On that note, immigrants often open up their own stores, but these are more often than not illegitimate and simply fronts for smuggling, whether that be more migrants or worse. They often take the form of vape or barbershops, but you'll hardly ever see any business in them. The government doesn't appear to be regulating them, but as we know, they support what's happening with replacement migration. English patriot Connor Tomlinson's video on this topic will be linked in the description. The people entering the United Kingdom are typically Indians, Pakistanis, Nigerians, and other South Asians. As with other European nations, this often correlates with imperial territories. This, and what the immigrants themselves say, also supports the idea that this is revenge. These people feel bitter about being colonized and subjugated, and now that they have the ability, they're invading in a very parasitic manner, eager for vengeance because of Britain's colonial past. Now, let's wrap up our analysis of the problem by taking a look at the crime statistics by ethnicity. This will tell us a lot. When looking at gun crime, homicides, knife crime, and robbery, white Britons make up only about a third of offenders on the highest end, despite being 82% of the national population. Also consider that not all white offenders are natives. Many are foreign whites who are part of groups generally also subject to deportation. Rape rates have risen dramatically, especially as the horrific rape gangs have come to light. Organized gangs of primarily Pakistani men, sometimes working with the police, have been for years trafficking girls and women by the thousands. A recent inquiry by Member of Parliament Rupert Lowe has estimated that up to 200,000 victims are a part of this atrocity. Now we need to ask the question, who do we want to remove? Traditionalism today sees this as being more simple than one might think. Immigrants and their descendants who arrived post-1945 will have their citizenships reviewed, and if they fail to meet all of the expectations, they'll be deported. Why 1945, though? That's the chosen date because it's when migration really started to rise. It didn't seem so bad at the time, but because of the need to rebuild, the government justified increased immigration. What are these requirements, though? They are: an immigrant must be a net positive taxpayer, as in they give more to the system than they take out. They must not have entered illegally or committed any other crime. They must be fluent in English, and they must be either irreligious or a Christian. Non-Christian religions, particularly Islam, have proven to be incompatible with Western values and thus should not be tolerated in European nations. Failure to follow all points on this list warrant deportation in our eyes, as if one has not met them, by now, there's no reason to believe they can ever integrate. If this list is followed through on properly, millions will be removed. As for how they're removed, Parliament under the Labour Party has already demonstrated how easy it can be. They revoked a former police officer named Mark Bullen's citizenship on the basis of national security and public interest, simply because he took an interest in Russia, visited it numerous times, and married a Russian woman. It's that simple. Oftentimes, people on the right claim something can't be done due to laws or precedents in place. However, the left shows us that with power, a government can simply change the rules and just do things. It's that easy. Another nation we'll take a look at is Germany. In 2026, Germans only made up about 71% of their own nation's population, down from 85 to 90% in the 1990s. Furthermore, in another 15 years, it's likely to be under 66%, a two-thirds majority, because of the death of older generations, more immigration, and low native fertility rates. But where are their immigrants coming from? Most are actually other Europeans, and the largest non-white group are Turks, who sit at about 3.4% of Germany's population. However, that large number of European immigrants is a problem. They sit at around 10% of the nation's population, and although they're more similar to a German than a third worlder ever will be, replacement is still replacement, and even if they only arrive for employment reasons, it's time for them to go home. The same list of requirements as the UK ought to be used in Germany. No criminal record, net positive taxpayer, fluency in German, and either a Christian or an atheist. There should also be a change to the labor laws in order to disincentivize both third worlders and Europeans from moving to Germany. Germans should always be prioritized, and if foreign workers were removed, wages would likely go up for those natives who are picking up the slack. This would make it easier to buy houses and improve the fertility rate by getting married and having children, which would further help the demographics. Finally, I want to take a look at America, my own home nation. Our situation might be the most complicated due to our sheer size, our number of immigrants, and our nature as a former colony. The latter causes a lot of confusion as to what an American is, and it makes it far harder to get people on board with remigration because so many think that we've always been open to all, and that anyone can become an American if they follow a vague set of values. Immigration to America has always been quite high, but for around 150 years, it was almost entirely white Europeans. In 1790, Only about a year after the adoption of our Constitution, to show how early this was, Congress passed the Naturalization Act, which limited the citizenship to free white persons of good character, as they put it. This remained the law for well over 100 years, until the Hart-Celler Act in 1965 abolished these restrictions, which had already loosened slightly to allow for Vietnamese and Chinese railroad workers. This opened the floodgates to the entire world, and we've seen very high, mostly non-white immigration for the decades since. Around half have been from Latin America, and they also account for half of foreign-born people. Another quarter of those immigrants have been from the Asian continent, with a significant portion being South Asians like Indians. When it comes to determining who to deport and how, I propose a review on the citizenship of everyone here due to the Hart-Celler Act. This means that if someone has just one ancestor who immigrated because of the loosened restrictions, they will have their citizenship subjected to consideration. Again, you can see that we're using the previous list of requirements, I think because it's generally a good template for various European nations. Additionally, we also have some experience with mass deportations, as the second Trump administration has managed to remove quite a few people, with estimates ranging from roughly 650 to 700,000. This has been helpful and is a good start, but it's nowhere near enough. Though at the same time, we must recognize that Trump, for all his failures, has managed to push the Overton window to the right. America's situation is unique when compared to Europe's. Non-whites, although historically a very small number, have resided in these United States for many generations, perhaps being able to trace their roots back to the 1600s when the first slaves arrived in the colonies. On the other hand, the mass migration of foreigners to Europe is a more recent phenomenon. Europe was more white than America for longer, and so it's a bit easier to make sweeping decisions on who goes. Now, I hope that this makes you appreciate just how complicated the issue can be. Now, if I may further complicate it, at Traditionalism Today, we also think that some immigrants ought to be allowed to stay. This does come out to be a very small number, but there are genuinely good people who either immigrated or were born in their new nations and have done everything right. Good, tax-paying, law-abiding Christians who do their best to integrate. We should not violate the dignity of those who have done nothing wrong. Ultimately, it's 2026, and by the time we conduct deportations, it'll probably be even further down the line. And we have the ability and technology to pay attention to many individual cases in order to make more specific calls. That said, in the end, we want to deport somewhere around 150 million people on the low end. The overall number is hard to know specifically, but it's likely over that when we consider the amount of undocumented people. The most important thing is the return of overwhelming demographic superiority for the native populations, while allowing for a loyal and high-quality minority of others who are urged to integrate. We will make more videos in the future on the topic of deportations and immigration, so let us know in the comments what you want to see us cover. What countries? Maybe more on how deportations will be done specifically. Thank you all for watching, and make sure that you subscribe, like, comment, and share. Also, please check out our X account. Both will be included in the pinned comment.